The two guests tonight really need no introduction. Diane Ravitch is the president and co-founder of the Network for Public Education. She's an historian of education and research professor of education at New York University. Diane blogs at dianeravitch.net, and her blog is close to surpassing 36 million hits. She has written 11 books, including her latest book, Slaying Goliath. Randi Weingarten was president of the United Federation of Teachers in New York City from 1998 until she became president of the American Federation of Teachers, the AFT, in 2008. Prior to her UFT presidency, she served as legal counsel to the UFT. Randi Weingarten is an active member of the Democratic National Committee, among many other civic organizations. Randi and Diane, thank you. And Diane, if you'll get tonight's discussion started.
Sure. Thank you so much, Carol. And Randi, welcome to the conversation. I can't think of anyone I'd rather talk to right now than you, because there's so many important questions that I have and that so many of us as parents, as grandparents, as educators have. And you have a lot of the answers. I don't think any of us know what's going to happen a month from now or 3 months from now or 6 months from now. But you've given more thought to it than I think almost anyone in the country. So I'm thrilled to have you on the conversation tonight. I think the first thing that's on everyone's minds right now is not only the pandemic, but what happens next in terms of the reopening of schools. I know that we're all concerned about the risk of opening them too soon, but lots of people are also very concerned about what happens if they don't open at some point. And I know that you have thought, and you and the Executive Council of the AFT have thought very hard about how to reopen them carefully. And so I'm throwing it to you. How do we reopen schools so that we protect the health and safety of both our children and the people who work in the schools?
So first off, Diane and Carol, let me just say thank you for having me. And I'm trying to be in a position where you can actually see the light, or that I have light on my face. We've all learned, how to do these kind of Zoom meetings in different places in where we live and operate, dependent upon what the light is during the day. And I just hope that this works. I'm very honored to be with you, Diane. And we have been through lots of different challenges, probably none like this one. And so let me just start by saying that you have several different challenges at the same time. You have a president who lies, which is the absolute wrong thing to do in a global health pandemic. You have then a health pandemic of unknown proportions because this is a novel coronavirus. And then you now have an economic catastrophe. And all three of these things, and then on top of it, 6 months before a new election, all four of these things create a lot of uncertainty and unease. And it gets right to your question about reopening. I am actually pretty lucky, not just that most of the people in my life have gotten better even when they were sick. And we had in my home local over 100 members who were actively employed in the New York City public school system die. New York City has been very much the center of the epidemic, particularly because we probably had coronavirus in New York City for several weeks before schools were closed. And so that has created a lot of anxiety and fear about how to open. But the reason I say I am lucky is that we have done in the AFT for the last 20 years, both UFT and AFT, a lot of work on health and safety. and a lot of work on pandemic planning, like Ebola, like MERS, like SARS, like AIDS, so that there is a comfort with the science, and the science here is so important. So we decided about 3 weeks ago that in the absence of the CDC providing its normal guidance, because whether it was Republican or Democrat administration, and Diane, you worked for a Republican administration, the CDC was God in terms of the science that you would then all look at in terms of when you confronted a public health epidemic. We may not have had enough public health funding, but the CDC was God in terms of deciding what it meant, what a disease or a virus or a pathogen or infectious whatever meant. But we saw that in the absence of CDC guidance about how you close, in the absence of any guidance from Betsy DeVos, given all the fear that was going on, and given the fact that Donald Trump, refused to actually be honest and consistent, not just in the downplaying of disease initially, but in the ongoing how you dealt with it, that we would try and talk to as many of the epidemiologists and the healthcare experts as possible and marry that public health advice with what we knew about schools. We also knew that at one point or another, the country would feel like it needed to reopen. I don't think that that's where the country is right now. The president is there, but not the country. But that if you're not prepared for that, we'd be in the same position as when we closed, that, it would happen on a moment's notice. And reopening schools take a lot of time, effort, and attention. So that's why, and it's on the AFT website. Anybody can download it. It's for free for people to download. But that's why we ended up putting this 5 pillars together. And the 5 pillars are the following. Number 1, and you saw this in Trump's plan. I mean, the through line of all of this is, in the absence of a vaccine, and it's hard to know whether we'll have a vaccine in the next 6 months or the next year, but in the absence of a vaccine, and in the absence of having the kind of testing that Donald Trump and Mike Pence get every day, so they know every day whether they're positive or negative, and they also know, and everybody who meets with them knows every day whether they're positive or negative, and so they don't meet with anybody who's positive. Only the people who are negative come to the White House. And even with that, there were some issues. So we said, what is it that you can do to actually reduce transmission of the virus in the absence of a vaccine and the absence of this kind of testing? And that became our 5 pillars. Number 1, that the number of, that there has to be very little virus in a community. And the way you know that is if the virus keeps dropping for 14 days straight. And that's what Governor Cuomo, you've heard Governor Cuomo, Governor DeWine, Governor Hogan, Governor Murphy, Governor Newsom, Governor Inslee, Governor Whitmer, all talk about, Pritzker, all talk about that. Number 2, you gotta have infrastructure of testing, tracing, and isolation, because that way, if you have a spike somewhere, you can contain it. Number 3, this is where the rubber hits the road. So there's still going to be virus in a community. What do you do? So you got to make sure that in a school, you have ways to prevent people who are asymptomatic, since most of the people who have the virus are asymptomatic. They don't manifest symptoms. You got to make sure that they're not communicating them from one person to another, whether it's kid to kid or kid to teacher or teacher to whoever. So you need to have the public health tools of physical distancing, washing your hands, cleaning the school, maybe temperature taking and screening if you need it, and mask if you need it. You need to have at least three of those 5 tools, particularly physical distancing. And then you got to marry that with what we need to do with kids, which is kids are pretty anxious. We need to actually have social emotional tools like guidance counselors as well as curriculum. And then we need to also make sure that the kids with the most needs get addressed. So you got to come up with models about what it looks like in terms of what school would look like in September or in a voluntary summer program. So it could be double sessions, like those of us who went to school in the 60s know, when schools were really overcrowded. Or it could be one day, like Randi goes to school Monday and Wednesday in school, Diane goes to school Tuesday and Thursday, and then Friday would be for a real focus on, special needs kids or enrichment or things like that. There's a bunch of different things you can do, but those models have to be planned right now. Number 4, if you don't talk to parents and you don't talk to teachers, then nobody's going to trust whatever you do, just like we don't trust what Trump does. And number 5, you have to have, if you think about this in a real way, this is going to cost more money, not less. So at the very same time as all of this, all the resources in states have cratered because we paused the economy, we actually need the $1 trillion that Nancy Pelosi is pushing right now in terms of state aid, local aid, and school aid. So do I know if this is the be all and the end all plan? No, I have no idea, really, truly. But I do know that we spent more time, energy, and effort talking to people and to experts. And now what we're seeing is in every state around the country, or a lot of states, people are looking at our guidance because they have no other guidance. And we think that this is a way of really thinking about all the different issues walking into September. I think there are going to be a lot of school openings in September. I think you're going to see Trump push very hard. He started today about school openings, but he's going to do it without trying to be safe and without trying to be responsible. And we can't do it without being safe and responsible. And that takes planning right now. And that takes making sure that we're dealing with all of the issues.
Oh, that's a good summary of the report that the AFT put out. But the thing that immediately comes to mind listening to you is that everything that needs to be done requires more money. Yeah. And at the same time, we're looking all over the country, massive budget cuts are being pointed at the schools. New York City schools alone may lose $800 million. And clearly, I mean, if you look at what other countries are doing, like Germany and the Netherlands, they are social distancing by cutting class sizes in half.
Right.
And how do we cut class sizes in half and have no more than 15 children in a classroom when the budget is going to be cut dramatically? And how do we stop that? And how do you and Lily and others organize a movement to have parents rise up and say, if we want our children safe, and the only way to have them safe is to cut class size?
Right. Well, the only way to do it is to actually stagger time, because we also we don't simply need to cut class size to make sure that the physical distancing works, but because we don't have sufficient number of school buildings to accommodate that, it's also going to mean staggering time.
And how do you stagger time if parents aren't home? One of the reasons Trump is pushing getting kids back in school is he wants the parents to go back to work. And if nobody's home, you can't really stagger the kids.
Well, what's going to end up happening is that employers are going to have to accommodate as well, because you're not going to be able to do one of the reasons that we are pushing on things like double session, which we've had in the past, is because that way you can stagger every single day. You can have like an A session and a B session, but that's going to cost a lot more money because you're going to have to clean the school in the middle of the day. And so, some people are talking about staggering Monday, Wednesday, Tuesday, Thursday. That is harder for parents, but you just put, very important point on the issue about how important schools are, both in terms of education as well as in terms of opening up the economy. And they become a linchpin to do both because so many parents are either working or need to work. And so, but if we don't do this right, we're going to invite a second surge, and a second surge will require closing down again. And I think that will be much more harmful for the economy than doing it right. But you know, Diane, that's part of why we need to actually do this planning now, because it raises the questions that you're raising, as opposed to, could you imagine if a superintendent just gave people a schedule in August for September and said, okay, you're on A session and you're on B session? Or, you know, and so we also have to accommodate what happens if, you know, for kids, if they need childcare for the second half of the day or for the first half of the day, or for, and whether we can use things like libraries and museums and the other kinds of places that where we might be able to do remote education or long-term projects, or maybe there are storefronts, maybe we can do community schools and wrap other services around. It is the focus on both on the public health tools, the alignment of the public health tools and the education needs are really pronounced here, which is why the planning has to go on now. But your other question is, as you can see, anybody who thinks about this for 3.5 minutes sees it's going to cost more money, less money. It's going to cost more money in terms of lowering class sizes. And if you have the space, you could lower class sizes and you could have kids in school every day, but that would actually mean double the number of teachers and double the amount of space. And I'm not sure that overcrowded districts can accommodate that. And I'm not sure that we have the funds to accommodate that.
It might be time. I'm kind of thinking back historically to an idea that was very popular in the early 20th century called the Gary platoon plan. And the platoon plan was that half the kids would be in classes and the other half would be in gym or in other kinds of large group activities where they weren't necessarily in contact with one another. They might be running around the playing field. But I think some creative thinking is needed.
Yes, absolutely.
Which leads me to another point, which follows from all of this, which is the question of distance learning. And I've had parents, including my own child, who has two young children in the schools, call me and saying, this distance learning absolutely sucks. It's got to stop. School has to reopen. The kids aren't really getting any real instruction. This is ridiculous. And so I'm concerned, firstly, because I think that a lot of entrepreneurs in the tech sector are moving in and trying to use this crisis as an opportunity to sell their product. A lot of the online charter schools are upping their advertising and marketing in order to draw kids away from public schools and into their miserable, failing virtual charters. But it worries me, for example, that Governor Cuomo invited Bill Gates and Eric Schmidt to reimagine education in New York. It worries me for several reasons. First of all, when you invite two tech specialists, you know what their answers are going to be. It's going to be more tech. And it also concerns me because he has actually constitutionally and legally no authority to reimagine education. We have a board of regents, we have a state education department, and I know that you're on the governor's advisory panel.
I know, shoot me.
So no, I'm not going to shoot you. I'm hoping that what you'll be is the voice of reason and sanity on the governor's panel, and make sure that he's not using this as an entering wedge to break down education as we know it, because I think that what most parents want and what most students want and what most teachers want is they want school. They don't want more distance learning. They want real school. They want human interaction and the social interaction that comes from face-to-face exchanges.
Exactly right. And so look, I mean, you and I are born to worry. And I think we need to look and always be concerned about, you know, what these entrepreneur types, and I would actually call them opportunists. I wouldn't even call them entrepreneurs, like how dare Goldman Sachs, within the first couple of weeks of this pandemic, say, oh, see, this is an opportunity for tech. And I do think that there are some in the tech industry that think that they can one more time try to do what I think this experiment just busted up. So let me just say, you know, on the one hand, I think now, just like on the issue of how do we have a parent-teacher coalition that fights for the money we need so that we don't forfeit our future, I think what's happened is that parents get more than they did 6 months or a year ago, how technology cannot substitute for in-person schooling. That at the end of the day, kids need that relationship building. Kids need the alchemy that happens when you are together in a community. And this isolation that we're all in is very wearing on everyone, but particularly on kids. And that's before you even talk about education. And so there is a respect and a gratitude for teachers now that's different than it was even a year ago. I also think that this experiment busted up the concept that virtual learning or remote learning is the be all and the end all. And so these opportunists are going to be walking right into a narrative that's completely the opposite of where they want to go. And I think that that's good news. The other things that it has busted up, just so I can get these all out, is that science didn't matter. Science matters a lot. And we need more kids to go into science. We need more Anthony Fauci's. We need more, you know, doctors and nurses and people who use science and understand science and run with it. The third thing that it has busted up is that government doesn't matter. Government really does matter, and that's part of the reason why the federal government, which is the only government that can actually print money, needs to backstop the states and the locals and the school districts now, because it's the virus that collapsed economies, and the need to do this physical distancing and the stay-at-home orders. And the fourth thing, which is really interesting as well, and really gratifying, is that regular people are the heroes here. The grocery workers, the meat packing workers, the transit workers, the transporters, the EMT workers, the food service workers, the teachers, the healthcare workers. All of these folks are the ones who have actually made the last 8 weeks possible to feed, to care, to engage, and to save Americans. And you see that kind of gratitude in people. We just did a poll, the ASME Union and us, of people in America about what they think about this notion of federal aid to states, locals, and schools. And 84% of Americans think it's important. Now, I don't think I've seen a poll that says 84% of Americans think anything together is important in this polarized environment. And of that 84%, 73% were Trump supporters. So I think that we start in a process where somebody's going to say, cheap it out, do remote, keep kids isolated. We start with parents and teachers and basically the public saying, what, are you nuts? And I think we're going to need to rely on that parent-teacher advocate partnership to actually push back the techies that want to make $1 off of this. And so in terms of the Cuomo Commission, you know, there's a lot of, I think he made a mistake. Let me just say this. I said this on Spectrum too, and they know I think this, and they put me on their commission anyway. You know, he had a conversation with Bill Gates about healthcare, and he overstepped and he overreached. And I don't know whether it's because they're completely tired or because they had an idea that this was going to cheapen, what they spend on schools. But they made a big mistake. And I don't actually think the Gates Foundation wants to be in another rip-roaring fight with teachers and parents in New York State. I think that they're very happy. The Gates Foundation is very happy to do public health, and they realized that they were wrong in trying to reduce everybody to a test score or to an algorithm. But so I don't think it's the Gates Foundation that's the issue. I did think it's the Goldman Sachs. I think it's these other tech companies. I think it's Betsy DeVos. I think it's the virtual charter schools. And I think that so I'm concerned about all of that. But I think if we can actually open schools safely and have schools as the predominant way that we deal with the rest, that we try to help rebuild relationships with kids and create that community again, then I think that will be a pretty big advocacy group together that stops this opportunism.
So we have another big train barreling down the tracks towards public education, and that is the Esperanza decision, about which you have written and spoken very eloquently. But if it goes against public education, then in my understanding from talking to you is that every state will be obliged to support religious education.
Right.
So the states now, almost every state is supporting a second sector, charter schools, and now we'll have a third sector, religious schools, and the pie is not only static, it's shrinking. So we have this pie in which 85 to 90% of the kids are in the public schools, and yet it will now be divided into two more sections. And what are your thoughts about that? How do we cope with this growing number of competitors for public funds?
So, you see this, look at what has happened in higher ed in terms of community colleges and state colleges and HBCUs and, the kind of desperate need for funding in order to create an opportunity for, forthcoming generations. And what this case, the Espinoza case, comes out of Montana. Let me just do, a minute of background.
Right.
And
I said Esperanza. You're right. It's Espinoza.
Yeah, that we're both tired. So the case, it was brought by the Right to Work, the Judicial Watch Network, and I just want to go back a step, which is that there is a group of people who have used the courts. They have unlimited money, and they've actually used the courts to try to limit other people's rights. And so it's the same constellation of people that have gone after whether or not there should be unions and whether or not people who are represented by unions should pay for that representation. And even after we lost the Janus case, which says that, regardless of whether you have representation, you don't have to pay for it if you don't believe in it. We have had that same outfit, the Judicial Watch, the National so-called Right to Work. They have now brought 80 cases against us in the aftermath of Janus. We have, knock on wood, won most of those cases, but think about how much money is spent in the defense of all of this. And so on that same constellation of these right-wing extremists that don't really want government and don't want to see a public good and want to constantly deconstruct and defund and destabilize anything that is done for the public good, they brought this case in Montana that basically said that you had to fund, if you fund any public schools, you have to fund anybody who wants their kids to be in a private or a parochial school. And they used the very slim precedent that arose a couple of years ago when a church group wanted to use a grant for building a playground. That this building a playground grant went to public schools and public places, and the church group says, I want to make sure I have this as well. And the court, in a very, very narrow way, said, this seems to be non-denominational program. So if this grant is for public schools or for public libraries or public places, if the church group is going to allow everybody to be there, why not let them have that grant? And so they have now used that to say that that means the free exercise clause of the Constitution is more important than the separation of church and state clause. And that's basically what's in front of the United States Supreme Court. The argument, now, so when we saw the case, because we knew that there's 34 states that have constitutional provisions in their state constitutions that basically say public dollars go to public schools. And if you want to create a private school or parochial school, you got to find other money. There's other states, the balance of the states, like Ohio, like Florida, don't have a clause in their constitution like that.
Florida does. Florida does. I mean, there are several states that do have those clauses, and they have very conservative courts that have said those clauses actually don't mean anything.
Well, but what this case will essentially attack is those clauses in those constitutions, in every single one of those constitutions. Because Florida, and you're right, Florida's courts overrode that clause. New York's courts, Montana's courts have basically said, the people have spoken, the Constitution basically is clear that public dollars only go to public schools. So the case that's up in the Supreme Court is questioning that. And basically the plaintiffs say, I want to send my kid to a voucher school, and I want every single dollar that if your kid goes to a public school, I want every single dollar that your kid gets, I want that match for my kid in a parochial school. And that's the case that's in the Supreme Court. So, you know, thankfully, the argument, there was a lot of skepticism during the argument about whether or not the court should be breaking new ground and essentially violating separation of church and state, and frankly, violating the free exercise clause. But we'll see what happens. Tomorrow may be the first day that, tomorrow is a Supreme Court day, and we may see a decision tomorrow. So we don't know if it's going the plaintiff's direction. We don't know if it's going the defendant's direction, which is the public school defendants in Montana, or if it's going to be a muddled decision. I would also add that there were many church groups, Jewish groups, the Board of Rabbis of Montana, for example, who actually said, no, we need our public schools to actually not, and public dollars to actually be free and to be free and fair. And we don't really want to be burdened as religion with any kind of accountability. And so we don't really want these dollars. So it's been interesting to watch the different religious sects on what they've been saying about this case.
Whose money is behind the demand for money for religious schools?
DeVos. It's the normal
DeVos?
suspect. It's the Koch network. It's Judicial Watch. It's
Walton's?
DeVos's network.
Walton's also?
I don't recall whether the Waltons were part of this catch.
Well, I guess that the upside is that even in states where vouchers are freely available, very few children are actually using them. I think
That is a really important point, Diane, that if you look historically about public schooling, take the last 50 years, by and large, 90, sometimes it's 89, 90, 91. If you looked at the last 50 years, that level of parents, 85 to 92, 93% of parents basically have elected to send their kids to public school, basically have chosen public school. Much of what has happened in terms of the charter voucher network is that charters basically took from parochial schools. We had, as you remember, we had a very robust parochial school network as I was growing up. You were, as you and I were both operating in New York, and there used to be a real connection between the parochial system and the public system in terms of that which we could do together. Like I remember Cardinal O'Connor saying to myself and to my predecessor at the U of T, Sandy Feldman, that most of the kids who were Roman Catholic went to public schools, and he saw the public school system as important as the parochial system that he and other of the Catholic dioceses ran. But what has happened in the last 10 years has been, like in the public polemic, less of the common good and more of the take, and destabilize and defund. And you're seeing the charter school, the for-profit charter school networks do that. And now you're seeing, because it's actually pretty hard to run a school, you're starting to see more and more of the same folks who want to destabilize public schools use vouchers, because it's far easier to give somebody a voucher to go somewhere than it is to actually run a school.
Right. Well, it's been interesting to me to see that in states like Louisiana and Indiana, where it's fairly easy to get a voucher, only 2 or 3% of the kids are using vouchers, and many of them were in religious schools anyway. Yep. And the other point that strikes me is that the charters have been killing Catholic schools.
Yes,
they pretend to offer the same education at no cost, and
exactly.
So right. Catholic schools continue to collapse as charters expand.
And the vouchers have had a terrible. It's just that the goalposts keep changing. If the goalposts were, how good the education is, voucher schools, and you could see it in Louisiana and Indiana, in Cleveland and Milwaukee, they've had a terrible record as compared to public schools, and even when they're siphoning off money from public schools. But it is this constant undermining of the public system and of the kind of monies and resources that we need to actually help all kids succeed.
Well, another point I would like to raise with you is the question of whither Biden. And I know that an advisory panel was announced today in which both Biden and Sanders supporters joined together to come up with a common framework on different important issues. And of course, you and Lily Eskelsen Garcia are on the education advisory panel, which is great, for public education. But I noticed that some of the Obama people are in key positions. And whereas I loved Barack Obama and I voted for him twice, I thought his education policies were horrible. We're no different from those of George W. Bush. And I'm very concerned about whether Biden is going to be listening to the critics of Race to the Top or whether he's going to be captured by the advocates of Race to the Top. We really, really need, and I'm speaking now, I think, on behalf of the Network for Public Education, we really need fresh thinking. We can't remain locked in the stale ideas of the past 20 years. And sure, more money is great, and I know that Biden has promised more money, but the question for us is, will there be a fresh vision in which he, and this of course has to be hashed out, and I don't expect you to answer for him, but the question that I have, and many of my colleagues, is, will he see the uselessness of the standardized testing regime that George W. Bush put in place and which we've been stuck with for 20 years? And will he see the invalidity of continuing to have federal support for charter schools, which, you know, they exist, they're not going to stop existing, but I don't see any reason for the federal government to continue funding. I mean, Betsy DeVos has used federal money as her personal kitty or slush fund. So I would just hope that the panel, as it operates, understands that that parents and teachers are hoping and hoping and hoping that people around Biden are not going to just resuscitate the stale ideas of the Bush-Obama years.
So I found so as you know, before we as a union endorsed Joe Biden, and I know him for a long time, I really like him, I like his wife, but as you know, I actually personally endorsed Elizabeth Warren for a bunch of reasons, including the fact that I thought the way in which she conceived her K-12 and higher education planks, as well as the economic issues, is that she had the moxie or intellect or great staff, whichever it is, to actually rewrite the rules to envision that new thinking about focusing on children's well-being, that if you meet children where they are and that you try to engage instructionally, but meet kids' primal needs, social, emotional, other needs, and you think about children and schools that way, then we would actually, I think, lift a generation of kids. And, you know, she had a proposal for 25,000 community schools, and she did a lot of what Bernie did in his plan, but I think she put it together in a different kind of connective tissue. I don't think, from even that period of time during the Obama administration, as things were playing out, I found Joe Biden to be a different cat than Barack Obama, even in terms of some of the really tough issues that we faced. I thought Race to the Top and this push of accountability from the top over everything else actually took us back 10 years. I think we've had to work pretty hard to try to figure out what are the best practices, not just what our instincts are, but what are the best practices for helping all kids, particularly poor kids, achieve. And it's certainly not standardized tests, and it's certainly not scaring teachers or scaring kids, because that's not the way kids perform, and that's not the way teachers perform. And it took us a long time to actually move away from that. I give Obama credit because by the end of his term, and I don't know too many presidents who have done this, he realized that the testing regime that Race to the Top imposed at the beginning of his term was not the right thing. And that's part of the reason that he and Lamar Alexander and Patty Murray and Bobby Scott and others really renegotiated the and throughout No Child Left Behind and Race to the Top for ESSA. Having said that, I think that Biden, from my interactions with him during the Obama administration, I think he had a different sense about this. I think, frankly, the stutter that he had growing up and having the kind of different needs and relying on teachers to help him gave him a different view. I also think that his wife has a very different view of education than Barack Obama did. His wife comes from the field, has been a professor in higher education and community college, as well as in K-12. And so even though some of those folks are around, I think he's very much his own person here. And that's why if you look at who he picked on this committee, you know, he picked Marcia Fudge, a congresswoman from Cleveland, who's very much focused on education. He picked Lily and myself, and he picked another person, and Bernie picked several higher ed colleagues, you know, who really know the theory of this. You know, unfortunately, there should be more people, and I'm glad we had the education forum this December where he heard firsthand from, you know, from teachers and from parents and from kids. But I would actually expect that he would have a different sensibility about this. The question becomes, though, what do we do going forward? It's not simply how do we not do Race to the Top? How do we minimize testing? But what are the, you know, what are the goals of public education? What do we need to do to help kids have the skills and knowledge and the relationships they need to tackle the world? And how do we help nurture that and support that and do that in the aftermath of a pandemic that has exposed every single inequality? And so I think we have to reframe the question in terms of what it is that we need to do to help all kids succeed. It's certainly not testing. It's certainly not privatization. It's certainly not austerity, and it's certainly not competition. But because you know we've had to fight all of this in the last 20 years, we need to, in some ways, create a new vision for what are the practices that will really help nurture kids' well-being, nurture relationships, create critical thinkers, you know, deal with resilience, and help kids have the skills and knowledge and relational abilities that they need to be able to really achieve in their lives, career, and college.
Well, I think that's well put. And if I can add that, I hope you will be an advocate along with Lily for reversing some of the very harmful policies of the past 20 years, where the federal government has taken it upon itself to mandate and claim that if you do what we tell you to do, no child will be left behind, which was nonsense. And I'm no big fan of ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act, because I consider Every Student Succeed to be the inverse, or the No Child Left Behind turned inside out. The idea that a federal law is going to make every student succeed is totally ridiculous. And it hasn't happened. It's had absolutely no impact. If you look at something like NAEP scores, there has been no improvement. In fact, the kids at the bottom have fallen even farther behind. And we still have this mandated grades 3 through 8 testing, which no high-performing nation in the world does. So I think that
Right.
one
actually
way
didn't work, you know.
well, one way to recover a better vision might be to look to the origins of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act,
Right.
which didn't have this kind of high-flown rhetoric built into its title. It's just ESEA. And its goal was equity. Its goal was to raise up the poorest kids and to make sure that schools that enrolled poor kids had the money that they needed to do a good job. I think we now know a lot more than people did then about the tremendous negative impact of poverty on families and on children, on communities. And I would hope that if there's a fresh vision going forward, it would be one that would be community schools that would build on the strengths of communities and also look to job programs and other programs that can address the tremendous inequality. I also think that ultimately, if we don't restructure the tax system to reduce the number of multi-billionaires in this country, then we'll just continue spinning wheels. But that's just my thought. And I want to say that, you know,
I think I think you're right. And I think you're right. I think what's interesting is that this period of time, that we pushed very hard to have the state test waivers, but to also have things like capstone ways of capping the year, like what the portfolio schools do in New York City, like how you have project-based instruction that is so important in terms of the career tech ed jobs of today and tomorrow. And, I think there's a real opportunity to think about, I don't want to use the word reimagine because now it's gotten toxic, but to think about what we need to do to meet kids' needs and to help nurture them so that they become the kind of resilient individuals they need to fly. And that was what ESEA did initially. It was, the first 25 years of ESEA, you saw huge breakthroughs because of the funding that was created and very much concentrated federal funding for kids who were poor because that was the equitable and the right thing to do. And I think we learned a lot during that period of time. But what happened, and you know this better than I do, was that the goalposts again kept on being moved on us because obviously nobody's going to be happy. Nobody's going to say, "Oh, we helped 58% of the kids." Our job is we have to help 100% of the kids. But the way in which that gets measured by these very blunt test, English and math test scores didn't work. And I think that both No Child Left Behind or Race to the Top, No Child Left Behind, ESSA, they all are proving that particular standard or metric is not what works. We need to really think about how we help all children and there needs to be some ways of measuring, but the measuring should not be the be all and the end all. The measuring should be where we are as a school system over a point in time, basically like, what PISA was supposed to do and what NAEP was supposed to do, not measuring every individual kid.
Well, the problem with standardized tests, there are many problems, but one of the problems is they are designed so that there will always be kids at the bottom.
Yeah.
And it's not like getting a driver's license where virtually everybody gets a driver's license. If you can drive a car, you get a driver's license. But on standardized tests, they design the test so that there are questions that 95% of the kids won't get, and they lay them out so that there are some easy questions, some hard questions. And there'll always be a gap because of the way the tests are designed. And I can't help but be reminded of a paper that Paul Barton of ETS wrote many years ago about the Black-White achievement gap and when did we make the most progress. And he said it was during the period of time in the late 70s, early 80s, which was the kind of the echo of the late 70s, where one, the government was promoting integration of schools. 2, there was increased economic opportunity for African-American families. 3, there was an expansion of early childhood. And all these things working together, economic opportunity, more money going into schools where the poor kids were, they actually worked. There was a dramatic reduction in the number of Black and Hispanic kids who couldn't read, couldn't perform basic skills. But I think that we We need to get away from this whole idea that people need to be threatened and punished and their schools should be closed if they don't meet
I
those goals.
completely agree.
This has been incredibly a horrible 20 years for many schools, because unless you're in an affluent district, you're working under this yoke of the threat of having your school closed and losing your job. And that's not a way to get the best performance from people.
Diane and Randy, this has been absolutely fascinating. And the hour has flown by.
Well, I've had a wonderful
So
time
we
talking to
have-
Randy. I haven't had a chance to talk to her alone for an hour, and I don't know how long.
we have people who are just dying to enter the conversation and ask you both some questions. So what's going to happen now is Darcy has been fielding and collecting questions, and she's passed them on to Marla Kilfoyle, and she's going to ask those questions on behalf of the people who are listening in.
Thank you, Carol. Good evening, Randy and Diane.
Hi, Marla.
Hi, Marla.
We have a lot of questions, and I'm sure you can surmise that a lot of them are about the pandemic. But first, we have to start with just a quick statement by Dr. Joseph Rica. He said he'd like to take a moment to praise all of our teachers who really had to kind of, you know,
They've been amazing.
yeah, change up at the last minute. Anyway, Randy, this first question is directed to you, and it's from Chris H. It's kind of a multi-pronged question. She said, what happens when several teachers on the same site test positive coronavirus? That puts obviously teachers and children at great risk. And then our second part of the question is, should we temperature check our students at the classroom door every day before allowing them to enter?
Well, I think that we should be temperature checking. So number one, if teachers test positive, just like if kids test positive, we have to contract trace, which means that basically look at every single person that person has been exposed to for like 15 or 30 minutes, and that all of them go into isolation for 2 weeks, just like Anthony Fauci is doing right now, because he was in the presence of, you know, of Stephen Miller's wife,
Katie Miller.
who tested positive. So that, you know, this is part of the science of actually averting another spike. And so, and what we've tried to do is say that in that process, if you don't have sick leave time or whatever, you should get paid sick leave. This is part of the nation's fight against a pandemic. And this is something that has to happen. You shouldn't be forced to think about, oh my God, I'm not going to get a paycheck, therefore I have to go to work regardless, because testing positive means that you are transmitting a virus that can be very serious to other people. So, but the issue becomes, how is somebody going to know that, you know, and where is the testing going to be? And, you know, can we do a baseline of, you know, testing all teachers or testing all kids? And are we going to have the millions of dollars that require that? I was talking to the mayor of LA a couple of days ago, who I think, by the way, has done a phenomenal job on the issue of feeding. Like, they're using school kitchens to feed everybody. And we're trying to figure out with World Central Kitchen and with pushing the, you know, for more SNAP money, why can't we use school kitchens around the country to feed everybody this summer, like they're doing in LA? So we were talking about that, and I was trying to get some information from him. He told me that they're spending over $1 million a day on the drive-through testing that they have, which is free for people. Now, in terms of kids, and that's why, Marla, you have to have these protocols in place that it's perfectly okay to test positive, and then this is the drill that happens. And we just hope that that person then gets better. But you got to stay home for, like, you know, we were, I'll just be really personal about this, both the weekend before, you know, everything shut down in New York, Sharon, who's my wife, is a rabbi. We were at her shul on Friday night, and we come to discover 2 days, 3-4 days later, that several people we interacted with tested positive, got very, very sick. I was also at the UFT that Sunday working with people to close the New York City schools, and several of the people that I was with that day got sick. And so I haven't gotten an antibody test or anything like that, but we, Sharon and I, then isolated and quarantined for 14 days. We didn't make a big deal about it, but we wouldn't go out because we didn't want to get anybody else sick. Yeah. In terms of kids, what we're envisioning is that you will have to, if the CDC, you have to ask the questions, do you have a fever? Are you sick? But a lot of, or you can actually do a temperature check. That's what they've done in South Korea. That's what they do in a bunch of other places. And if the CDC warrants it, which is they did, then they didn't, now they do again, just like with masks, that is a perfectly appropriate screening device. But we have to make sure we socialize it, meaning we have to make sure parents know that that's going to be the drill, and that if a child has a fever, then there's going to be an isolation room and with a nurse, and we're going to actually make sure we can get the child either home or to a place that's safe, because the child shouldn't be with the other kids that day. We have to make sure we can't transmit the virus in a school.
Great. All right, as I'm sure you also understand, we have a lot of people concerned about online teaching replacing brick and mortar buildings. So we have a couple questions here as well. And Diane, I'd like you to jump in on the second part of this, because I know in the past couple of things, we've talked a lot about how we fight against the disruptors of education, and this kind of moves to that. So the first question is from David Bloom. And David is asking, what work is being done to ensure that online teaching is temporary? And then we have another question from Paul Eck from Oregon. And he says in Oregon, they're touting personalized learning and ongoing formative evaluations. How do we neutralize this move by leaders of AstroTurf groups to really push this? So people are concerned that online teaching is going to replace our brick and mortar buildings. So what do you have to say about that?
Well, the first thing I have to say is the AstroTurf groups are going against parents in America. They're going against the evidence. They're going against parents. They're going against what has become the real narrative. But we still have to worry about it, because they're going to try to use their money, their power, their influence, and they don't really care about what's right. They care about how they make money. And so part of what we're trying to do by focusing on how do we reopen is that we're just, in some ways, saying we're trying to do safely what is the right thing to do. And what these other groups are relying on is that they're hoping that they can use the pandemic to keep people isolated and to have a situation where this is the only thing parents can do. Kind of like when vouchers or charters try to take money away from schools and say, see, parents, that school doesn't have the programs you want, so come to my shiny little school and you'll get those programs. It's kind of like trying to convince people, trying to make things so bad that they convince parents that this is the only choice. So part of what we're doing is knowing full well that people are fearful because of the way we closed, because of the lack of the information, because of, the lack of consistent and honest information. People are scared. So we're trying to actually work with people to overcome that fear. And, if somebody, and to see what we can do, because I suspect that if we can actually open schools in the fall, a bunch of this stuff will fall by the wayside because of where parents are and because of what we've known. We know remote doesn't work. And we know the isolation doesn't work. So what these other groups are doing are just being opportunistic.
Yeah, let me just jump in and say, first of all, a shout out to David Bloom, who is a public school teacher in Los Angeles. And when the Network for Public Education auctioned off my first edition of the Charles Eliot Great Books, David Bloom was the winner. So hi, David. And I want to say to the second part of the question, which was from Paul in Portland, that you have to think about personalized learning as depersonalized learning. It's a misnomer to call it personalized. When you put a child in front of a computer at home, that's not personalized learning. And when you have distance learning or remote learning, that's not personalized learning. Personalized learning is what happens in a classroom when there's a teacher and children who are able to talk to one another and exchange views, and where the teacher can offer support, encouragement, or whatever the situation requires. And I think that, and I'm echoing something that Randi said here, one of the possibly positive results of this absolutely horrendous and tragic era is that parents have had their belly full of distance learning, and they're frantic. They're frantic to get their kids back in school. They feel their children are isolated. They miss the companionship of their friends. They want to sing together with others. They want to be in the school play. They're brokenhearted that there's no performances, that there's no graduation ceremony. All these ceremonies and rituals are very important in children's and adults' lives as well. And they're not prepared to give that up. And I think that having learned what distance learning means, they don't want it. So the people who are selling it are going to find that there are really no buyers out there. And that's a very good thing. And that the task before us as a nation and as people who care about children and about the future of the society is to make our schools the very best they can be, and to make this argument to politicians that they must not make children bear the burden of the economic crisis that we're in. The devastation has hurt tax revenues everywhere, but children should not be the ones who bear the burden of the cuts that are coming. Right. There are other ways to address them, either by trimming someplace else or by raising taxes on those who can afford to pay them.
Great.
Yeah, we can't. I mean, I think Diane is absolutely right. We cannot forfeit our future. And many of us, I suspect, on this Zoom have fought the fight when we have forfeited our future. But the other thing I want to say to everyone here is that we have learned, I think in the last few years, that the combination of activism and elections help change narrative, help change policy. And that even when we are physically distant, we can still use our voices. We can still make calls. We can still actually, we're thinking about car demonstrations. We're thinking about mobile billboards. We're thinking about how we do these kind of things in a safe way to actually show up and make these fights. But part of what we're trying to do is make sure we do it safely and people feel not unempowered, but empowered. Activism and elections have been, think about the West Virginia strikes, think about the Oklahoma strikes, think about what we've done together as people in community who have really, changed the nature of the debate and have resurrected the importance of public schooling even pre-pandemic. And the other thing I want to say is, as your first speaker said, or the first caller said, Marla, teachers changed on a dime. Yeah. And a dime. We did our first press conference on coronavirus on February 2nd. Nobody was stupid. We saw what was going on and we didn't have the information. And think about what would have happened if we could have prepared in February for all of this. But Trump and others chose not to let us prepare. And so, we're not going to let the opportunists take over from us and take the and pull opportunity from our kids or from who we are. And we ain't going down without a fight, both in terms of the resources that we need and the public schools our kids deserve, and that many of us have spent years trying to actually nurture and trying to support.
Great. Okay. So we have a couple of questions about charters and virtual schools. So I'm going to weave these two together because they're sort of the same thing. The first one is from an anonymous person, says, it's to you, Randi. You talk a lot about the for-profit charter sector. What about the damage that is being done by the nonprofit sector like Success Academy and other huge nonprofit chains that are draining funds from our public schools? And then the second part of that about charters is from Reverend Charles Foster Johnson from Pastors for Texas Children. He says, isn't now the opportune time for a moratorium on charters and also the right moment to expose the inadequacy and insufficiency of virtual schools? So I'll let you address those two, Randi. And then Diane, if you want to jump in, please do.
Okay, thanks.
So do you want to start with Diane and then with me, or you want me to start?
You can start.
Let me just say a word about the virtual charters, and then Randi, I'll throw it back to you to talk about how the nonprofits suck money out of the regular school. It's not just for-profits. The virtual charter schools are a disaster. In every state where they operate, they are the lowest performing schools in the state. And whether it's, especially Pennsylvania, but also other states that have virtual charter schools, they are the lowest, they have high attrition rates, they have low test scores, they have very low graduation rates, and they're also fiscally irresponsible. The biggest virtual charter in the country was in Ohio. It was called the Electronic Classroom of Tomorrow. And it operated for 20 years, sucked $1 billion out of the budgets of public schools. And then when the courts asked them to repay 60 million because they had so many ghost students who didn't ever attend a class, they said rather than pay back 60 million out of the billion they had collected, they decided to go bankrupt. So they're a disaster, and I think that parents really have to be warned against them. And that K-12 Inc. has been on the warpath with lots of marketing and advertising. They are the biggest of the, and they're a for-profit virtual charter chain. And I think there needs to be a lot of advocacy to let parents know, don't enroll your child in a virtual charter school. It's a scam.
So this is where, so I have a lot to say on this issue, and we probably need a whole hour just on this. Meaning, a lot of the reasons that, I completely agree with Diane about the virtuals. We have actually done all sorts of different advocacy exposing the virtuals. But think about what this process has done. Meaning, if the virtuals were worth anything, they would be killing it right now in terms of the last 8 weeks on remote learning. But because they're so bad and so ineffective, they couldn't even use what was a tailor-made situation for them. And yes, they're advertising, but their product is such crap, it doesn't mean anything. And so what's happened is that we now have just gone through this huge experiment where parents don't want, for all the reasons Diane and I've already said, this kind of remote education. They want kids to be together, but they also want, and this gets to my second question, and this is the place where I want people to listen to me without attacking. Part of the reason that charters and vouchers have had resonance is because parents want to send their kids to a school that they believe will help their kids. And charters like the Success Academy that Eva Moskowitz has done. And for those of you who don't know, Eva Moskowitz went after me and created a star chamber in the New York City City Council and tried to rake me over the coals for hours when she was a city council woman, and tried to blame the New York City Teachers Union and the work that we had done to help kids through thick and thin for all that ails America. So Eva got lots of money and made lots of advertisement, but as a lure to say to parents, I can do something better than what you have right now. If we could do what Diane just said before, how do we help every single public school be a place where parents want to send their kids, educators want to work, kids are engaged? Then you wouldn't have any charters. Because at the end of the day, that's what parents want. They want neighborhood public schools that nourish their kids. And charters have become, whether they're for-profit or not-for-profit, competitive models because we haven't been able to do that. It's not our fault. We haven't had the kind of resources or the things that we need. But if you look in Ohio, for example, in Cincinnati, when we created these community schools, which were full service and met the needs of kids, parents took their kids out of the charters and brought them back to public schools. So I would actually really focus on, yes, leveling the playing field, not letting charters get away with the lack of accountability that they've gotten away with, not having, Betsy DeVos have what she does with them. But at the end of the day, my focus is on how we make sure public schools get the funding and the resources to get all they need.
Well, there's another aspect to the charter. I wouldn't say the charter success, but rather their competitive advantage. And that is that they can make the promise that there won't be any disruptive children in the school. And that if you're used to a school where there are kids with disabilities and there are kids who don't speak English and there are children who are problems, they won't be in the charter because first of all, they won't be accepted. And if they're accepted and they don't have high scores, they'll be kicked out. And I've been in places in the South where they said the charters down here are just a way of saying you don't have to go to school with those kids. So
Yeah.
that's another promise. And we're trying to do something else in public education.
And so, they kick out kids who are disruptive. They don't take kids who have special needs. But, what we've tried to do as a AFT is we've actually also tried to organize charters. I mean, look, I still run one in New York City and in the Bronx that has done pretty well by kids. But we're trying to make sure that charters are not competing with public schools or siphoning off the money that public schools need. And we do actually need federal, the equity policies that make sure that they don't have this kind of competitive advantage. And frankly, when they don't, what you see is when you shine the light on them and they don't have a competitive advantage, what a shock. Public schools basically do better than charters, just like public schools basically do better than vouchers.
Right. Well, let me just add, if I can throw in my own twist on this discussion, which goes to several things that Randi has said about the importance of science. We have a president who has made scientists afraid to speak their mind. And so when Dr. Fauci wants to speak up, he knows that he's at risk of losing his job. When any scientist, whether the CDC or the FDA or any of the scientific NIH, when they disagree with the president, they know that they're at risk of being fired. We are seeing right now in our time the most dangerous politicization of science that we've ever seen in our lifetime. Maybe it happened 50 years ago or 80 years ago, but never in our lifetime have we seen a president who said, you may not speak based on the evidence. And that's why right now, and this is something Randi mentioned at the very beginning, we don't even have guidelines from the CDC. And the CDC normally puts guidelines out as soon as they have the evidence in hand. This is what you should do. This is what you should not do. We're in the middle of a pandemic, and there are no guidelines because the president doesn't want guidelines, which might conflict with his view that everything's fine and getting better. So we're in a bad way as a country because I think if FDR were president, if Hillary Clinton were president, we would see federal leadership and we would see a national program that was comprehensive and that really reached out to every American to make sure that we were all working together and had a sense of solidarity, a belief that we're all in this together, instead of saying, I'm safe and too bad for you. There is what we're getting from Washington is lie upon lie, and also this kind of rugged individualism that basically says to everyone, you're on your own, and all the governors are on their own. And this is insane. I think we're a laughing stock in the world.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. It's completely, no other country. I mean, there's lots of other countries that have huge partisan differences. Take Israel, huge partisan differences. But people believe in the science. Denmark, people believe in the science. Norway, people believe in the science. Germany, people believe in the science.
And they're lucky to have a president, Angela Merkel, who is a scientist.
Yeah.
They trust her. She doesn't lie to them.
Yep.
Randi, we have one more question from Lisa Gallo. She wants you to talk about the idea of reopening New York City public schools. What do you see in terms of logistics and other things?
So, I mean, look, New York City is my home. And we decided, as I said before, Sharon, my partner, is a rabbi of a synagogue in New York City. And we decided that we were gonna bunker down in our home for this, for the last several weeks. And so I am, I think New York is certainly flattened curve. On the other side of the curve, I'm, concerned, as are many others, about the kids who are starting to show Kawasaki disease syndromes. My sister is a doctor at Montefiore, so I talk to her a lot about what she's seeing. She's an ICU pediatrician, so I talk to her a lot about it. But from everything that we're seeing, we feel, and I've talked to Michael Mulgrew a lot, we are really trying to see what we can do in terms of reopening schools in September. It's not going to be perfect. It's going to be some kind of staggered model. The Principals Union and the Teachers Union are working closely together with Richard Carranza and are talking a lot to parents. You saw the petition that the UFT and parents put out about the kinds of things that were necessary. But there is a real push to try to see what kind of models could work to both limit the transmission in a school, particularly given how fearful we all are, given what happened in February and March in New York City, and to also make sure that we marry that concept with what do we need to do instructionally. So that's why things like thinking about double sessions is one of the things on the table. Does it work? Does it not work? Does it work in a school that's overcrowded? What do you do? Do you have classes, lower class size? Okay, that works for the classes you have, but what about if there's more kids then what about if you have, 100% overcapacity? Do you use auditoriums? Do you use gyms? Can you accommodate a school where you have one session in the morning, one session in the afternoon? If you can't do that, can you do Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday? Can you do Monday, Wednesday, Tuesday, Thursday? So they are starting to try to model out with programmers what it looks like in terms of the basics. But then on top of the basics, what do we need to do in terms of curriculum? What do we need to do in terms of social services, in terms of support services? How do you do lunch? How do you do breakfast? What happens in terms of younger kids versus older kids? So all of those questions, Lisa, are things that people are thinking about right now and just kind of throwing on a whiteboard and saying, how does this look? And they feel an obligation to, create some models to see if they work, because we're in really uncharted territory. And at the same time, what would a hybrid look like? What would remote learning look like? How do you use libraries? How do you use museums? And so all of these questions are being thrown at right now, but thinking about a basic model, and then does it work? And how do you make sure we're taking care of the kids who are sick, taking care of kids who are immunocompromised, taking care of teachers who are immunocompromised, so that we can actually challenge the virus in the New York way of thinking, which, is pretty cool, but we have to do it responsibly, and we have to do it carefully and safely.
And on that note, we've run out of time. And thank you so much, Randi. And thank you, Diane, again. And thank you, everybody who came and participated and listened. We have a lot of people who are watching us on Facebook Live tonight. And next week, Diane's going to be speaking with Mike Hines, a very extraordinary superintendent from Long Island. And we welcome you all back. Thank you, Randi. Thank you very much. Stay safe. Diane, same to you. And same to everybody who joined us this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, Guy. Thank you, Carol. Thanks,
Bye,
everybody. Stay safe.